My son charged me $7,000 a month in rent for the very house I once built with my own two hands. I was breaking my back at 3 different jobs, just to hand over every penny to him while he and his wife sat in the living room with wine glasses, laughing at a life they didn't earn. One night, I dropped a cup on the floor, just a small accident from my tired hands, and she screamed at me like I was filth, like I was a servant who had overstayed his welcome. In that moment, with my son standing beside her nodding as if I deserved it, I knew something inside me had finally broken. Before I begin, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, because sometimes stories like mine travel further than I ever imagined my voice could. The alarm always went off at 4 in the morning, sharp as a blade. My body rose on command, though every muscle groaned like an old machine long past its prime. 64 years old, yet I carried the aches of a man closer to 90. I slid my legs off the side of a narrow cot, wedged into the corner of the guest room that still smelled faintly of the football gear my son once left there as a boy. Now I was the one paying him $7,000 every month just to sleep in it. That number wasn't just on paper, it lived inside my bones. Every hour I worked, every step I dragged through cold mornings, it was there, pressing, reminding me I was a guest in a home I had given away after my wife Clara passed. I thought I was helping my boy start his new family while I drowned in bills and grief. I thought I was handing him security. What I really handed him was my own chain, tightened month after month with my name on the bottom of it. The kitchen floorboards creaked under me as I tried to move without sound. I poured water into the coffee maker, the small comfort I clung to. But even that wasn't safe anymore. The gurgling was too loud for a house where my presence had become an inconvenience. "Too noisy," came her voice from the hallway. Marissa, my daughter-in-law, robe tied tight like she owned the walls themselves. Her painted nails shone like red warning lights even in the early morning. She wasn't supposed to be awake. I froze, cut the machine off, poured what little had brewed into a cup, and left before another word could cut me down. Outside, my old truck sputtered, groaned, and finally coughed to life. It embarrassed her, she said once, that rusty thing sitting in front of their expensive cars. To me, it was the only reason I could keep 3 jobs, the only faithful thing I had left. Driving to my first shift, the city half asleep around me, I thought of how far I'd fallen. Once I was the man who built furniture by hand, who held Clara's hand on front porches, who promised his son a future better than his own. Now I was the man who scrubbed floors for strangers, and handed rent to his own blood. And yet even then, I didn't know the worst was still waiting. A storm that would strip me down to my last breath before I found the strength to rise again. The grocery warehouse smelled like dust and cold iron, the kind of place where time never seemed to move. My shift started at 5 sharp, and by then my arms were already trembling from lack of sleep. I stacked crates, dragged pallets, and nodded through the chatter of men half my age who laughed about weekend plans, while I thought only about how many hours it would take me to cover the rent my son demanded. The numbers haunted me. $7,000. 7,000. I repeated it in my head as if saying it often enough might make it less absurd, less cruel, but it only made the weight heavier. Every paycheck was split before it reached my pocket. Half to him, half to debts, nothing left for myself. Even coffee felt like a luxury I had to earn twice before I could taste it. Breaks didn't belong to me anymore. 10 minutes on a bench with a paper cup of water, my supervisor hovering with kind eyes, asking if I was all right. I always said yes, because the truth was too humiliating. How could I tell anyone that the son I once raised on bedtime stories and backyard games now treated me like a tenant who needed to be squeezed dry? How could I admit that the house where I once tucked him into bed was now a cage where I paid to be insulted? So I smiled, lied, and went back to lifting until my back screamed. By noon, I traded the warehouse for the janitorial job at an office building downtown. Empty desks, humming computers, trash cans filled with scraps from people who earned more in a day than I did in a week. I pushed the mop, wiped the glass, polished the steel. My reflection looked back at me in every surface, a man shrinking, shoulders bent not only by years but by betrayal. I remembered the nights I worked overtime decades ago to pay for his school trips, his sports, his every dream. I remembered Clara shaking her head with a tired smile, telling me I spoiled him. She was right. Maybe I had taught him to take without teaching him the weight of giving. Evening brought the diner, the clatter of plates, the smell of grease, The endless parade of faces, asking for coffee refills. I scrubbed the counter, cleared the tables, listened to the waitress laugh with a voice that had learned how to fake joy. Midnight arrived like a hammer, my bones hollow, my chest tight. I drove home to the house I no longer recognized, lights blazing, laughter spilling from the windows. Inside, they sat at the table with takeout containers stacked high, the kind of meals that cost more in one night than I made in 2 shifts. I walked past them like a shadow, offered no words, because I had none left that wouldn't taste like blood. In the silence of my rented room, I lay awake, the numbers ticking in my head, the laughter echoing through the walls. And for the first time, I began to wonder if a man could disappear from his own family and still keep his soul intact. The alarm on my phone buzzed again before the ache in my body had even cooled. I splashed cold water on my face in the diner's restroom, staring at the mirror until the tired man looking back at me almost felt like a stranger. My 3rd job was over, but the night wasn't. It never was. Sleep came in scraps, 1 or 2 hours stolen in between shifts, never enough to trick my bones into healing. I drove home with my eyes burning, knuckles white on the steering wheel, praying that the truck's engine wouldn't give up on me the way everyone else had. As I turned into the neighborhood, my chest tightened. This was the street where I once taught my boy how to ride a bike, running behind him, steadying his little shoulders until he found his balance. I could still hear his laughter echoing down the block, that pure sound of a child who trusted his father to never let go. I had let go once, but only because I knew he was ready to pedal on his own. That night, pulling into the driveway of what was now his house, I realized he had let go of me long before I was ready. I remembered working double shifts back then, years ago, just to make sure he had what I never did. New sneakers for basketball, brand new school supplies every September, summer camps, music lessons. Even though he lost interest in half of them before the first season ended, I didn't care. I wanted him to have choices. I wanted him to grow up never knowing the hunger I felt as a boy when my father's wallet was as empty as his promises. I broke myself to build a life for him, and now he was charging me $7,000 a month to live under the same roof. My sacrifice had become his leverage. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the smell of expensive takeout. My son, Daniel, lounged on the sofa in a crisp shirt that cost more than my week's pay, scrolling on his phone. Marissa curled beside him, perfectly manicured, sipping from a glass of wine that gleamed like a ruby in the light. They looked like royalty, like the heirs to something I couldn't recognize. My entrance barely registered. I wasn't father anymore. I was background noise. A tenant. A man tolerated because his checks cleared on time. I walked past them, silent, into the room that was no longer mine. The walls felt narrower every day, the air thinner. I sat on the edge of the bed I rented from my own blood, my head heavy, my hands raw from scrubbing other people's floors. The sound of their laughter filtered through the walls, muffled but sharp enough to pierce. I pressed my palms together and whispered to the silence, asking Clara if she could see what had become of the boy we raised, asking if she would forgive me for what I had allowed. And in the hollow quiet that answered me, I knew the man I had become was not the man she once believed in. Morning came too soon, as it always did. I dragged myself from the bed that wasn't mine, my body aching from a night too short to matter. I tried to move quietly, to avoid the sharp glances and sighs that greeted me whenever I disturbed their perfect rhythm. But it didn't matter. Marissa was already in the kitchen, robe tied tight, her hair pulled back like she was preparing for battle. She leaned against the counter with her coffee cup, the way a queen might watch a servant polish the floor. Her eyes slid over me, cool and dismissive, as if I were another piece of furniture cluttering her space. "You left crumbs yesterday," she said flatly, pointing at the counter. "We can't keep cleaning up after you." Cleaning up after me. The words landed like stones. I swallowed whatever reply rose in my throat and simply nodded, though the truth was I had scrubbed that counter until it gleamed before I left for work. Daniel shuffled in a moment later, stretching, his phone in hand. He barely looked at me. My son, the boy who once clung to my arm when he was scared of thunderstorms, who once begged me to read him one more story before bed, now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "Dad, you've got to be more careful," he said casually, like I was a careless child. "We can't afford to replace things all the time." The we stung. They were a team, united in their disdain, while I stood alone. I remembered him differently. I remembered the nights he'd fall asleep on my chest while I sat in my old armchair, rocking him gently so Clara could rest. I remembered the afternoons we built tree houses together in the backyard, his small hands gripping a hammer I guided. Back then, he looked at me like I was invincible, the man who could fix anything. Now, he looked at me like I was the problem that needed fixing. Marissa's voice cut through my thoughts again. This arrangement isn't working unless you learn to respect the rules of the house. Rules of the house. The house I once owned outright, the house I had signed over to Daniel after Clara passed, thinking I was giving him security. I had told myself it was a gift, a way to unburden him, to show trust. But somehow, that trust had become a contract written in chains. They sat together at the kitchen table, the two of them close, laughing at something on her phone screen while I stood there invisible. My rent money had bought their comfort. Tea, their wine, their glossy furniture, and their polished life. But no amount of money could buy me a place at that table again. I turned, walked back to my room, and closed the door. My hands trembled, not from exhaustion this time, but from rage I no longer had the strength to bury. In that moment, I realized something was shifting inside me. Something that had been dormant for too long was finally beginning to wake. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that used to mean barbecues in the backyard, laughter spilling through the open windows, Clara humming along to her favorite records. Now Sundays were just another workday, except heavier, because the house no longer felt like mine. I had come home between shifts, exhausted, my shirt clinging to me with sweat. I wanted only a sandwich, a shower, and a few minutes to let my bones rest before heading back out into the world. The kitchen smelled of garlic and cream sauce, and when I glanced at the counter, I saw containers from the most expensive Italian restaurant in town. They had eaten like kings again, while I had skipped lunch to afford gas. My eyes fell on the receipt, crumpled and tossed carelessly aside. $223. That was more than I made in a day. My hand shook as I reached for a plate from the cabinet, and before I could steady myself, it slipped. The crash echoed like thunder, shards scattering across the tile in a bright starburst. The sound brought them both instantly. Daniel appeared in the doorway, hair still mussed from an afternoon nap. He looked at me not with concern, not with compassion, but with irritation. Marissa followed close behind, her robe swishing, her eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. I dropped to my knees, gathering the pieces before they could say a word. A sharp edge bit into my palm, blood dotting the floor, but I pressed my lips shut. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me groan. That was from the good set, Daniel said, his tone sharp, as if I'd broken it deliberately. I mumbled an apology, but the words fell flat in the air. Marissa folded her arms and tilted her head, the smirk playing at her lips colder than any winter wind. "We asked for one quiet afternoon," she said, her voice heavy with contempt. "And you can't even manage that. You can't keep doing this." "I'll replace it," I said quickly, though even as the words left me I knew how ridiculous they sounded. I had no money for such things, not while every dollar funneled into their pockets. Her laugh was brittle, hollow, cruel. "With what? You can barely keep up with rent." I looked at Daniel then. I begged him silently to remember me, to remember the father who held him, who gave him everything, who would have torn his own heart out to keep him safe. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. His arms crossed over his chest and he said softly, "She's right, Dad. You need to be more careful. We can't keep replacing the things you break." The words landed like a hammer to the skull. We can't keep replacing, as if I were the child, as if I were the burden. Then Marissa stepped closer, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. "You're a useless old man," she hissed, and for a heartbeat I thought the insult would kill me, but instead something colder, stronger, slid into place inside me. A small, unshakable truth. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They would not make that mistake again. I rose from the floor slowly, blood still seeping from my palm, the sting grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't defend myself, because I understood then that no defense would matter to people who had already judged me guilty of existing. Instead, I turned away from their sneers, walked back into the small room I rented from my own son, and closed the door. My knees buckled, and I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded suitcase tucked beneath it. For weeks I had thought about leaving, but the thought always felt like a fantasy, a coward's dream. Tonight, it felt like the only truth left. My hands shook as I pulled the suitcase out. The zipper rasped open like a match striking. I began to fold my clothes. Only what was necessary, shirts that could survive the laundromat, pants that didn't require ironing, socks worn thin from years of use. I gathered my medications, the small bottle of painkillers, the inhaler I prayed I wouldn't need during long shifts. I took a few photographs, Clara smiling in the garden, Daniel as a child holding his first baseball glove. I hesitated on that one, but tucked it inside anyway. It wasn't his cruelty I wanted to remember. It was the boy he once was, the boy who had believed in me. Midnight came and went. The house fell into its practiced quiet. I moved like a ghost, each step measured, each breath shallow. I left an envelope of cash, next week's rent, on the kitchen table. The last they would ever see from me. My exit would not be a theft, not even of their money. It would be my liberation. I placed my key beside the envelope, the metal clicking softly against the wood, and I knew I would never touch it again. Outside, the night air struck my lungs cold and sharp, but it felt cleaner than any breath I had taken in months. The old truck groaned awake, louder than I wanted, but nobody stirred. I loaded the suitcase into the back, the sound of it sliding across the bed of the truck final and heavy. My hands gripped the wheel, and for the first time in years I felt something close to control. The headlights carved a path through the darkness as I drove away, the house shrinking in the rear-view mirror until it was nothing but shadow. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay. I drove aimlessly until I found a roadside motel, its neon sign buzzing like a tired heartbeat. I paid cash for a room that smelled of bleach and old smoke. The bed sagged, the lamp flickered, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't paying to be insulted. I wasn't handing my dignity to anyone. I sat on the edge of that lumpy mattress and whispered to the empty room, "You're free." My voice trembled, but it carried the weight of truth. The motel room hummed with a loneliness that almost felt alive. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew and thy. The sheets were rough against my skin. Yet as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. No footsteps pacing outside my door. No sighs of disappointment waiting in the kitchen. No sharp words thrown like knives at the simplest mistake. Just silence. A silence that belonged to me. I dozed in fits, my mind racing faster than sleep could catch, until the red digits of the clock blinked 2 a.m. I reached for my wallet, pulled out a folded napkin with a number scribbled in blue ink. One of my coworkers at the diner had slipped it to me weeks ago, whispering that her landlord sometimes had vacancies. Cheap, clean, cash preferred, she'd said. At the time, I'd tucked it away, not daring to believe I would ever need it. Now it felt like a lifeline. My hand trembled as I dialed. Each ring stretched long, like the phone itself was judging me. On the fourth, a man's gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" I swallowed hard, heart hammering. "I'm calling about the apartment," I said. "A friend gave me your number." There was silence, then a weary sigh. "It's 2 a.m. I winced. "I know, I'm sorry, but I can pay first month in cash right now." Another pause, heavy but not unkind. "You running from something?" he asked. My throat tightened. "Not something," I said. "Someone." He didn't press. "Be at 412 Maple, 8 a.m. Bring first month and deposit, $500 each." The line clicked dead. I stared at the receiver for a long moment, then set it down, my hand trembling with something I barely recognized. Hope. By dawn, I had lined up the bills on the desk, neat as soldiers, the $1,000 that would shear away most of my savings. It was a dangerous gamble, but staying would have cost me far more than money. I didn't sleep again. Instead, I watched the sky pale through the thin motel curtains, each shade of light a reminder that this day would be the first of my new life. At 8 sharp, I stood outside a modest brick building with my envelope clutched tight. The man who opened the door was in his 60s, hair thinning, eyes sharp but not cruel. "You the guy from the phone?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, extending a hand. He gave me a once-over, like a mechanic inspecting a used car. Then he led me up a narrow staircase to a one-bedroom unit. The floorboards creaked, the baseboards were scuffed, the appliances older than I was, but sunlight streamed through the window in a wide golden square. It felt like a promise. "It's perfect," I heard myself say. The landlord nodded. "Keep it simple," he said. "Rent due on the 1st. No excuses. Take care of the place, and it'll take care of you." He slid the keys onto my palm, warm metal pressing into skin that had almost forgotten how ownership felt. For the first time in years, I wasn't a tenant in my son's house. I was a man in his own home. I closed the door behind me, and the sound of the lock sliding into place was like thunder in my chest. The apartment was small, barely big. Enough for the battered suitcase I carried, but it was mine. Mine. No footsteps outside the door, no whispered arguments behind walls that weren't really mine to begin with, no rent check with my son's name on the other end. Just a key in my pocket and a space that belonged only to me. I set the suitcase on the floor and stood for a long time in the middle of that room, letting the sunlight spill across my shoes. I thought I might cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I laughed, the sound strange and foreign in my throat, like a bird that hadn't sung in years. The kitchen was nothing more than a counter with a stove older than my marriage had been, but when I set the coffee pot down and poured water in, the sound was sweet. It gurgled, sputtered, and hissed, and for once no one told me I was too loud. I leaned against the counter, hands wrapped around the chipped mug I'd brought from the thrift store on the way over, and breathed in the steam. It was the simplest thing, a cup of coffee, but in that moment it tasted like freedom. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, as though each item carried the weight of proof. Shirts folded into the dresser, photographs placed on the small nightstand, socks in the drawer. I spread the quilt Clara had made years ago across the bed. It smelled faintly of cedar and old memories, and when I pressed my hand against it I could almost feel her there. She would have told me to leave a long time ago, I realized. She would have told me that no man should pay to be disrespected in his own home, not even by his own blood. The first night, I sat on the floor with a sandwich balanced on my knees, staring at the empty walls. They didn't mock me. They didn't sigh at me. They didn't demand anything but my presence. That silence was heavier than I expected, but it was mine to carry. For the first time in months, I ate without rushing, without looking over my shoulder, without feeling like I had to justify every crumb. The quiet stretched around me, not punishment, but protection. I pulled out a notebook from my suitcase, an old habit I'd nearly forgotten. On the first page, I wrote a sentence as steady as I could manage. Never again will I pay to be humiliated. I underlined it twice, the pen digging into the paper. That night, I slept on the bed that creaked with every movement, but the creaks didn't matter. The pillow was thin, the blanket frayed, but the sleep that came was deeper than any I had known in years. I wasn't a tenant anymore. I was a man rebuilding his life, brick by brick, rule by rule. The phone started ringing before I'd even finished unpacking. At first I stared at it, unsure whether to answer. Old habits told me to pick up, to explain myself, to soften the blow of my leaving. But another voice inside me, a quieter one I hadn't heard in years, whispered that I didn't owe them a single word. I let it ring until the sound became a kind of background noise, like traffic or rain. By the end of the night, it had rung 20 times. By morning, 40. Daniel's voice came first, leaving messages that swung like a pendulum, angry one moment. How could you walk out like this without even telling me? Then soft the next. Dad, just let me know you're okay. Then angry again. You think you can just leave like that after everything I've done for you? Everything he'd done for me. I almost laughed when I heard it, but the sound caught in my throat. Marissa's messages were sharper, dripping with false sweetness. We're worried about you. Please, just come home. This is all a misunderstanding. Then, a little later, you know this isn't sustainable. You'll come crawling back once you realize you can't survive without us. Her voice cracked on the last word, but I knew it wasn't grief. It was fear. Fear of losing control. I silenced the phone, set it face down on the counter, and let it buzz itself to exhaustion. The quiet that followed was like oxygen. For the first time, I wasn't answering out of guilt, wasn't bending myself into the shape of their expectations. I was just me. That night, I sat at the small table by the window with a pen and an index card. I wrote rules, simple ones, rules I wished I had made years ago. 1. Answer only what I choose. 2. Spend only what I have. 3. Sleep when I'm tired, not when I'm allowed. 4. Eat sitting down, with no shame. 5. I am not the villain for wanting peace. I stuck the card to the refrigerator with a magnet the landlord had left behind, a cartoon rooster with faded paint. It looked silly, but it felt like a guard standing watch. The calls kept coming, but they no longer rattled me. I stopped checking the voicemails. I stopped explaining myself, even silently. Instead, I listened to the sound of the building, neighbors' muffled laughter, a television humming through the wall, the creak of someone walking upstairs. These weren't warnings or threats. They were signs of life. the ordinary kind that didn't demand my blood in exchange. Lying in bed that night, the cut on my palm from the broken plate throbbed faintly, a reminder of the moment everything had changed. I pressed it to my chest and whispered into the dark, "You're safe now." For once, I believed myself. It didn't take long for me to notice the rhythm of the building. Life moved here in a softer key, not loud and polished like my son's house, but lived in and human. The walls carried voices, laughter, the clink of dishes, the sound of a child running across the hall. At first I braced at every noise, expecting irritation or judgment, but it never came. Instead, the sounds folded around me like proof that people could live side by side without cruelty. One afternoon, as I carried a small bag of groceries up the stairs, a voice called from the front garden. A woman, hair cropped short and silver, was kneeling in the soil, coaxing bright green shoots into neat rows. She looked up, her face kind but firm. "You the new upstairs?" she asked. I nodded, clutching the bag tighter. "Yes, ma'am, just moved in yesterday." She smiled like we'd known each other longer than a single day. "Well, welcome. I'm Evelyn. Everyone calls me Ev. If the laundry machine eats your quarters, bang the side twice. That usually does it." I laughed, the sound awkward but genuine. She grinned wide, pleased that she'd pulled it out of me. Later that week, I ran into Mr. Garcia, my landlord, on the stairs. He was carrying a box of tools, moving slow but steady. "How's the place treating you?" he asked. "It's perfect," I told him, and I meant it. He nodded once, satisfied. "Good. You take care of it, it'll take care of you." There was no malice in his words, no hidden edge, just a simple agreement between men. It was a language I hadn't spoken in too long. Even the smallest exchanges felt like revelations. A young mother on the first floor smiled at me as she wrestled a stroller through the door. "You're upstairs, right? Nice to meet you." A man in 2B tipped his hat when he left for work at 4 in the morning, both of us nodding in solidarity as two people who knew the weight of early hours. No one asked me for money. No one rolled their eyes at the way I moved. No one made me feel like a ghost walking through someone else's home. At night, I sat by the window with my sandwich and coffee, listening to the world outside. Children laughed in the courtyard. Someone's radio played an old love song, and I felt something I hadn't in months. Belonging. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't expensive, but it was real. I thought about Daniel and Marissa then, sitting in their catalog-perfect home, their laughter hollow, their love measured by receipts and demands. And I thought about Ev in her garden, Mr. Garcia fixing latches himself, the young mother smiling through exhaustion. There was more dignity in this modest building than in all the marble counters of their house. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had neighbors instead of captors, and that, I realized, was worth more than all the rent in the world. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Even with the ringer silenced, it trembled across the counter like a trapped insect, each vibration reminding me of the life I had just walked away from. I couldn't throw it out, not yet, but I also couldn't let it dictate my every breath anymore, so I powered it down, slid it into the drawer of the kitchen table, and let the silence wash over me. For the first time in months, the quiet wasn't empty. It was mine. Still, I knew avoidance wasn't enough. If I left things undefined, Daniel and Marissa would claw their way back into my life with excuses, manipulation, and guilt. They would show up at my door one day, and without clear rules, I risked being dragged right back into the cage I'd escaped. I had to make it plain. I pulled out a sheet of paper, the kind with faint blue lines, and set it on the table beside my pen. The first few moments, I only stared. What does a father say to a son who has turned into a stranger? What words are left when love has been twisted into leverage? My hand shook as I began. But once the first sentence was written, the rest came steady, like water breaking through a dam. "Daniel, I am safe. Do not come to my home. Do not call my workplace. If you need to contact me, write to this P.O. box I have opened. I will read letters on Sundays. I will not pay rent to live in your house." The envelope I left behind was the last of that arrangement. "I will not discuss finances that are not mine to carry. If you wish to see me, we can meet at the public library on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock for 30 minutes. If you or Marissa raise your voice, the meeting ends. If you are late by more than 10 minutes, the meeting is canceled. I love you. Love is not the same as enabling." I set the pen down and read the letter twice. It was not warm, but it was honest. It was not cruel, but it was final. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line that could not be moved. I folded it neatly, slid it into an envelope, and wrote his name across the front. Not son, not Daniel, just his name, as if reminding both of us he was an adult now, responsible for his own choices. At the post office the next morning, I dropped it into the slot. The sound it made, faint and hollow, echoed in my chest like a bell. It was done. The boundaries were set. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. As I walked back to Maple Street, I felt taller somehow, as though with every step I was reclaiming inches of myself I'd given away piece by piece over the years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a man who could still choose his own rules. Wednesday came like a storm I had circled on my calendar. I sat in the library early, back against the wall, the genealogy section behind me, because I had learned a long time ago to never leave my back exposed when dealing with people who want to rewrite history. The smell of old books calmed me, but my hands still trembled against the table. I wasn't afraid of them anymore, not in the way I once was, but I knew the power of their voices, the way they could twist guilt into a chain. At exactly 2:07, Daniel walked in. His hair was combed too neatly, his shirt crisp, like he was dressing up for a role he wasn't sure how to play. Marissa followed close behind, sunglasses perched on her head even though the day was gray. She scanned the room as though expecting to find an audience for her performance. They sat across from me, their movements rehearsed, their faces calm in the way liars look calm. "You left," Daniel began, his voice tight. "You didn't even say goodbye." I folded my hands on the table and looked him in the eye. "I said goodbye every day for months," I replied. "You just didn't hear it." Marissa leaned forward, lips pursed. "We're not the villains here. You living in the house was making everything complicated. For all of us." "For all of us," I repeated softly. "Or just for you?" Her mouth twitched, but she recovered quickly. "You know you can't survive like this. That apartment, those jobs. You're not young anymore. You'll be crawling back once reality sets in." I almost smiled. Reality set in the day I realized I was paying to be insulted in a house I built with my grief and my labor. I will not do that again. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his hands. "We were just asking for respect, Dad." "Respect," I said evenly, "doesn't sound like calling me a useless old man. Respect doesn't mean taking every dollar I earn and demanding more. Respect. See, it doesn't mean silence from me so you can be comfortable." For a moment the mask slipped, his mouth opened and closed like he was a boy again, trying to form excuses. Marissa reached for his arm, a quiet warning, and then turned back to me with her practiced smile. "You've made your point, but this all feels dramatic." I slid an index card across the table. On it, I had written my rules in neat handwriting. Wednesdays, 30 minutes, public places, no yelling, no money exchanged. "These are the terms," I said. "If you can follow them, we can talk. If not, this is the last time we sit across from each other." The librarian glanced over her glasses at us, her eyes sharp and watchful. It made me feel steadier. Daniel's shoulders sagged. Marissa scoffed, but she didn't argue. We sat for 20 minutes, words circling but never landing. When they stood to leave, they looked smaller, not because I had won, but because I had finally refused to play their game. A week passed after that library meeting, a week filled with quiet I hadn't tasted in years. I worked my shifts, came home to my small apartment, and slept without waiting for footsteps outside my door. But peace never lasts long when someone is determined to shatter it. One evening I found Mr. Garcia waiting at my door, envelope in hand. His face was unreadable, but his tone carried that edge of suspicion I had hoped never to hear. "This yours?" he asked, holding the envelope out. I frowned. "What is it?" "Someone slipped it under my door. Said it was for you. Rent money, from the look of it." I took the envelope and peeled it open. Cash, neatly folded bills, enough to cover 2 months' rent, maybe 3. My stomach nodded. I didn't need to ask who had left it. I could smell Marissa's perfume in the faintest trace on the flap, and Daniel's guilt written in the way the bills were stacked too carefully. It wasn't generosity, it was bait. Mr. Garcia raised an eyebrow. "If you can't afford the place, we can talk, but I don't like funny business." I handed it back to him, my grip steady. "It's not mine, and I don't want it. If they come around again, tell them I said no. I pay my own rent in cash on the 1st. That's the deal, nothing else." He studied me for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Good," he said simply, tucking the envelope under his arm. "I respect a man who stands on his own 2 feet." And with that, he walked away. I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. For a moment, the temptation had whispered in my ear, "Take it. Rest. One less week of scrubbing other people's floors." But I knew the trap. That money came with invisible strings. A thread tugged today would become a rope around my neck tomorrow. And I had sworn to myself, on the first night in this apartment, never again would I pay for humiliation with my silence. The next Wednesday at the library, Daniel tried to bring it up casually, as if I hadn't already found the proof of his scheme. "Dad, we just wanted to help you out. You don't need to struggle like this. Let us cover the rent, just for a little while." I cut him off with a raised hand. "You slipped cash under my landlord's door. Don't insult me by pretending it was kindness. That was control dressed up as charity." Marissa shifted in her chair, her smile brittle. "You're being stubborn. Pride doesn't pay bills." "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "But dignity keeps me alive. I'd rather scrub floors until my hands bleed than let you buy me back into chains." The librarian looked up again from her desk, and Daniel's face burned red. For the first time, he had no answer. He looked like a boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except this time the cost wasn't cookies, it was me. That night, after the meeting at the library, I walked home slower than usual. The streets glowed with the soft yellow of street lamps, the kind of quiet evenings Clara used to love. She would slip her arm through mine on walks like this, humming under her breath, pointing out the stars as if they were neighbors she wanted to introduce me to. I felt the ache of her absence deep in my chest, sharper than it had been in years. When she died, the world blurred. I moved through those months like a man underwater, everything muffled, each breath stolen from me. The house we had built together became a tomb, every wall echoing her laughter, every room carrying her ghost. Daniel was the only thing that tethered me to the surface then. He was grieving too, or so I believed. He told me the house was too much for me to handle alone, that it would be better if he and Marissa took it, helped keep it running, gave me stability. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I signed over the deed, thinking I was securing a future for the boy we had raised, the boy Clara loved more than anything. At the time, it felt like love. It felt like protection, but looking back now, I see it clearly. Grief had blinded me. I wasn't giving him security. I was handing him power, and he used it, not with gratitude, but with greed. I sat at the little table in my apartment, Clara's quilt draped over the back of my chair, and closed my eyes. I could still see her face the day we moved into that house. She had touched the walls as if they were sacred, whispering that this was where our family would grow, where Daniel would take his first steps, where we would grow old together. She never lived to see how that dream turned to ash. I had kept the house alive as long as I could, working double shifts, patching pipes myself, mowing the lawn even when my knees ached, all for the sake of keeping our promise alive. And in the end, my own son turned it into a prison. The weight of it pressed on me, heavier than the crates at the warehouse, heavier than the mop handle in my hand at midnight shifts. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about rent. It was about trust, love, sacrifice. All the things Clara and I had poured into our boy, being twisted into leverage against me. My heart burned with shame, but also with something fiercer, something cleaner. I whispered to the empty room, as if Clara could hear me through the walls of whatever heaven she had found. I see it now. I see him for who he's become, and I won't let him use my love against me again. The son. Words shook, but they were true. For the first time since she died, I felt like I was standing on solid ground instead of drowning in grief. The second Wednesday felt different before it even began. My chest was steady, my mind clearer, though I knew I was walking into another storm. The library had become neutral ground, a sanctuary of quiet rules and watchful eyes, and maybe that was why I chose it. Lies have a harder time breathing in places built for truth. Daniel and Marissa were already seated when I arrived, her legs crossed neatly, his hands fidgeting with his phone. She looked up first, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "You're late," she said, though I wasn't. The clock behind her read 1:59. I sat down anyway, folding my hands calmly on the table. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but heavy. "Dad, this is ridiculous. You don't need to live in some dingy apartment. You have a home. With us." I met his gaze, holding it steady. No, Daniel. I had a home. You turned it into something else. Marissa scoffed, flipping her hair back as if my words were no more than dust. You're being dramatic. We asked for rent because nothing in life is free. You raised him to understand responsibility, didn't you? I almost laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from humor. It was the kind that bubbles up when the truth is too heavy to keep inside. Responsibility is putting food on the table for your family. Responsibility is working double shifts so your child has new shoes for school. Responsibility is burying your wife and still finding the strength to keep the lights on. Responsibility, I said, leaning in, is not charging your grieving father $7,000 to live in his own house. Daniel flinched, his eyes darting to the table. But Marissa? She smiled wider. $7,000 was generous. You should be thanking us for keeping you afloat. The venom in her voice almost drew a reaction from me, but I bit it back. Anger was what she fed on. Calm was my weapon. I don't owe you gratitude for my own blood and sweat. I don't owe you gratitude for my own roof. Daniel's hands tightened around his phone until his knuckles whitened. Dad, you're twisting this. We've been helping you, supporting you. You wouldn't make it out there without us. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because I believed them, but because for so long I had lived as though they were true. I took a slow breath, then shook my head. I'm out there now, and I'm alive, more alive than I've been in years. If that scares you, it should. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft shuffle of pages from nearby readers. For the first time, I saw it clearly in Daniel's eyes. Not anger, not even guilt, but fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of realizing the grip they had on me was slipping. Marissa reached for his hand, her nails pressing into his skin, anchoring him to her. I stood, sliding the chair back quietly. 30 minutes are up. And with that, I walked out, leaving their silence behind me like smoke from a fire I refused to breathe anymore. The days that followed feasts. Lot lighter, though my body was still tired from work. The heaviness inside me had shifted, no longer the kind that chained me, but the kind that came from rebuilding brick by brick. On Maple Street, people didn't look at me like a burden. They saw me as just another soul trying to make it through the day. That simple recognition felt like medicine. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air. Evelyn was already in the garden, her knees pressed into the dirt, her hands covered in soil. She glanced up and waved me over. "You look like a man who could use a project," she said, pointing to an empty patch of earth by the fence. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. I haven't touched a garden since Clara was alive. She had the green thumb, not me. Evelyn shrugged. Dirt doesn't care who plants it, just needs someone willing to show up. Her words stuck with me. I knelt by that bare patch of earth, the soil rough under my hands, and for the first time in years I felt Clara's presence not as a wound, but as a whisper. She had loved her roses, her herbs, the way she coaxed life from nothing. I remembered her teaching Daniel to press seeds into the ground, his small fingers curling in the dirt. Back then he had believed things would always grow if you loved them enough. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe I had too. I bought a few cheap packets of seeds from the corner store. Tomatoes, beans, sunflowers, nothing fancy. I dug with my hands, sweat running down my back, letting the soil cling under my fingernails. There was something grounding about it, something that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of making something grow instead of watching everything wither. Neighbors began to stop and talk as they passed. A young boy from 2B knelt beside me, peppering me with questions about plants, about how long it would take before the green pushed through. Evelyn brought me a trowel and gloves, shaking her head with mock exasperation at my bare hands. Mr. Garcia nodded approvingly when he saw the neat rows forming. No one asked for rent. No one asked for favors. They only offered company, laughter, tools. I hadn't realized how starved I was for such simple kindness until it was placed in my hands like water after a drought. That night, as I sat by the window, I looked down at the garden. It was nothing more than small mounds of dirt lined up like soldiers, but to me it was hope. Each seed was a promise, each row a reminder that new things could begin even after old things had died. For years I had worked only to survive. Now, for the first time, I was working to build something for myself. And that felt like freedom I never thought I'd taste again. It was on a Tuesday night, just after my shift at the diner, when I saw him. I had taken the long way home, cutting past the old neighborhood, maybe out of habit, maybe because some part of me still needed to see the house I once called mine. The lights inside glowed bright, music spilling out through the open windows, the sound of laughter that didn't belong to me anymore. I should have kept driving, but I slowed instead, the old truck rumbling low as I passed. That's when I saw a man I didn't recognize step out of the front door. He was tall, dressed sharp in a suit that didn't match the neighborhood, his shoes gleaming under the streetlight. He shook Daniel's hand, too firmly, like he was staking a claim, and clapped him on the shoulder as if Daniel were a soldier under his command. Marissa hovered in the doorway, her smile stretched too thin, the way a person smiles when they're hiding their fear. I watched as the man lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and then drove off in a black car that whispered money and danger both. My chest tightened. Daniel had always been impulsive, but he was still my son. I knew the look of a man tangled in something bigger than himself. I'd seen it when I was younger, in men who owed debts they could never pay, in neighbors who got pulled into things they didn't understand. That handshake wasn't casual. It was a chain being clasped. The next day, I tried not to think about it, but the image lingered. At work, scrubbing the floors of an office where no one even knew my name, I replayed that handshake again and again. At night, while I watered the seeds in the garden, I saw the gleam of that man's shoes in the dark soil. Evelyn noticed my distraction and asked what was wrong, but I only shook my head. Some truths were too heavy to lay on kind strangers. 2 nights later, I drove past again, and this time, there were 2 cars parked outside, engines idling. Men leaned against them, smoking, their eyes sharp, scanning the street. Inside, I caught a glimpse of Daniel through the window, his shoulders stiff, his hands moving fast as he spoke. Marissa's face was pale, her mouth tight, her movements sharp and nervous. It wasn't just tension, it was fear. I parked further down the block, watching for a long time, my heart pounding. I wanted to march up the walkway, pound on the door, and drag Daniel out the way I used to when he was a boy about to make a mistake. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man, and men who walk willingly into cages of greed and shadow often drag others down with them. That night, lying in my small bed, I realized with icy clarity, my son wasn't just cruel. He was being used, and if I wasn't careful, his choices could still destroy me, even from a distance. The unease wouldn't leave me. Every time I thought about Daniel shaking that man's hand, my stomach knotted tighter. I'd seen enough in my life to know that kind of alliance didn't end with a friendly pat on the shoulder. It ended in ruin, and something told me that ruin might already have my name on it. I went down to the bank on my day off, a place I hadn't stepped into for years. The young teller smiled politely when I asked to see a record of any accounts or loans tied to my name. She typed quickly, her nails clicking against the keys, and then her smile faltered. "1 moment, sir." She disappeared into the back, leaving me with my pulse thundering in my ears. When she returned, she was carrying a folder, her expression careful. "We have several active accounts under your name, and—" She hesitated, her eyes flicking up to me. "There are 2 loans, both substantial." The words slammed into me like a blow. "That's not possible," I said, though. The tremor in my voice betrayed me. She slid the papers across the counter, and my own name stared back at me in bold black ink, beneath signatures I didn't recognize but that were close enough to mine to fool a system that didn't care to look deeper. 2 loans, one for $25,000, another for $50,000. My name, my social security number, my entire future tied to debts I had never touched. The air seemed to leave the room. I gripped the counter until my knuckles whitened. "Sir, are you saying this isn't you?" the teller asked gently. I forced myself to breathe. "No," I said, my voice low. "That's not me. That's someone using me." I walked out with copies of everything, the weight of those papers heavy in my hands. Sitting in my truck, I stared at the signatures again. Daniel. It had to be Daniel. Or Marissa. Or maybe even that man in the suit. But it was Daniel's access. Daniel's opportunity. I had handed him the house, the paperwork, the trust, and he had turned it into a weapon. Back at my apartment, I spread the papers across the table, Clara's quilt draped over the chair beside me, as though she were there to bear witness. My blood burned hot with rage, but beneath it was something colder, sharper. Betrayal was one thing. Fraud was another. My son hadn't just bled me dry with rent. He had tied my name to chains that could strangle me long after I was gone. I picked up the pen, writing everything down in my notebook. Dates, amounts, account numbers. I wasn't just a broken old man anymore. I was building a record, a shield, maybe even a sword. They had mistaken me for weak, for blind, for someone who would accept humiliation quietly. But now I had proof. And with proof, even an old man could become dangerous. I didn't plan it. I didn't sit down and weigh the risks. Didn't ask myself if I had the strength. The moment I held those papers in my hands, the moment I saw my name shackled to debts I never touched, something inside me snapped. Rage carried me. Rage and the faint memory of the man I used to be. The one who built things with his hands, who never bowed to anyone. That man rose up in me again, and before I knew it, I was driving back to the house I once called mine. The driveway was lined with cars, sleek and polished, machines that whispered of wealth far beyond Daniel's means. I killed the engine of my old truck, the sputter loud and embarrassing, but I didn't care. My boots hit the pavement hard as I walked up the path, each step fueled by years of silence I had swallowed. Marissa opened the door before I even knocked, her eyes narrowing like she had been waiting for me. "Well, look who decided to visit," she said coolly, folding her arms. "If you're here to beg—" "Beg?" My voice was sharper than I expected, loud enough to make her flinch. "I didn't come to beg. I came for answers." I shoved the papers toward her chest. "Explain these." She glanced down, and for the first time the mask cracked, her lips pressed thin, her eyes darting past me to the street as if searching for an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice trembled. Behind her, a figure stepped into view. The man in the suit, cigarette still burning between his fingers, his smile slow and practiced. "Ah," he said smoothly. "Why, you must be the father. I've heard so much about you." His tone was silk laid over barbed wire. Daniel appeared next, his face pale, his collar damp with sweat. "Dad, it's not what it looks like." "It looks like theft," I snapped. "It looks like betrayal. It looks like you used my name to dig yourself into a hole and thought I'd be too old, too tired, too broken to notice." The suited man chuckled, taking a long drag of his cigarette. "Big words for a man with nothing. Your son has vision. He just needed backing." "With my name," I said coldly. "With opportunity," he corrected, stepping closer. His cologne was thick, suffocating. "And don't flatter yourself. We don't need you. We only needed your signature. Paper doesn't ask questions." My fists clenched, but I forced myself still. Hitting him would give him power. Instead, I turned to Daniel. "Look at me, boy. Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't sign my name." He couldn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, shame painting his face in colors I hadn't seen since he was a child caught in a lie. "Coward," I whispered. "I raised you with my sweat and my blood, and this is what you've become. A coward hiding behind a suit, and a woman who only loves your money." Marissa bristled, her nails digging into Daniel's arm. "You don't know anything about us." I stepped back toward the door, my voice steady now, no longer fueled by rage but by certainty. "I know enough, and I promise you this. My name will be cleared, one way or another." And with that I walked out, leaving the smell of smoke and fear behind me. I drove away from that house with my pulse still pounding, the night air rushing through the cracked window as if trying to cool the fire burning in my chest. But even as I left them standing in their polished kitchen, I knew my words had hit harder than I intended. I had seen it in Daniel's eyes, the shame, the guilt, the faint flicker of the boy he once was buried under layers of arrogance and fear. For the first time in a long while, I felt that maybe he wasn't completely lost. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my P.O. box. Not Marissa's sharp handwriting, not the smooth print of a lawyer's notice, but Daniel's own messy scrawl. I unfolded it slowly, sitting in the quiet of my apartment. The words were uneven, as if his hand had shaken while writing. "Dad, I don't know how to explain things. I messed up. I thought I could handle it. Marissa said it was smart. The rest of the sentence trailed off into scribbles. "I know you hate me right now, but I didn't want it to get this far. I never thought it would hurt you. I'll fix it, somehow." I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands trembling. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it wasn't defiance either. It was fear, naked and raw, and though part of me wanted to crumple the paper and toss it in the trash, another part felt the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed in months. Hope. At the next library meeting, he came alone. No Marissa, no suit, just Daniel, slumped in his chair like a boy caught outside in the rain. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first. His voice was low when he finally spoke. She told me it was temporary, just paperwork. Said it would help. P.S. qualify for something bigger. I didn't think... He stopped, his throat tightening. I didn't think it would come back on you. That's the problem, Daniel, I said quietly. You never think past the moment. You've been taught to grab what you can and let someone else pay the cost, and for years I let myself be that someone. His eyes lifted then, red-rimmed, desperate. I didn't mean for it to be you. I leaned forward, my voice steady. But it was. And it is. Those papers have my name, my number, my life tied to debts I never touched. You think men like that one you're shaking hands with will care about excuses? No. They'll come for me, or for you, and you won't be ready. He swallowed hard, the silence stretching between us. For once, he had no slick reply, no hollow defense, just silence, heavy and trembling. When the 30 minutes ended, I stood. You need to decide who you are, Daniel, I told him, because right now you're nothing more than a shadow of every bad choice you've ever made. As I walked away, I heard him whisper my name, soft, broken, not Dad, but something smaller, like he was reaching back for a hand he hadn't held in years. And for the first time, I believed he might actually want to change. The morning after that meeting, I made a decision I should have made long ago. I walked into a small cell phone shop on the corner of Main and Fifth, the kind of place with fluorescent lights and posters curling at the edges, and told the young clerk I wanted a new number. No transfers, no history, no strings. He looked at me strangely, but I handed over the cash and walked out with a cheap flip phone that felt like a weapon in my palm. My old phone, stuffed with missed calls and voicemails from Daniel and Marissa, I left powered down in a drawer. Let them shout into the void. Let them burn their voices out on silence. With the new phone, I felt lighter. No more jolts of dread when the screen lit up. No more manipulation waiting at the press of a button. My life had space again, like air filling a room that had been locked tight for too long. I returned to my apartment and wrote the new number only on one slip of paper. I gave it to Mr. Garcia in case of emergencies, and that was all. Nobody else. Work still bruised my body, but I noticed something shifting. At the warehouse, I no longer moved like a man carrying invisible chains. At the office building, the reflection in the glass looked tired, but not hollow. At the diner, I caught myself humming under my breath as I wiped down counters. It wasn't joy exactly, not yet, but it was something close, something I thought I'd buried alongside Clara. In the evenings, the garden began to sprout. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, fragile but stubborn. Evelyn grinned when she saw them, clapping her dirt-stained hands like a child. "Told you so," she said. I knelt beside those rows every night, touching the leaves gently, amazed that something so small could carry so much promise. It reminded me of Daniel as a boy, his first shaky steps, the way he looked at me with wide eyes as if I had hung the very sun in the sky for him. The memory was bittersweet, but for once it didn't break me. It fueled me. I built routines in my new home. Coffee at dawn, silence while the world still slept, lunch on the stoop, watching kids chase each other in the courtyard. Dinner, simple and steady, no takeout receipts mocking me from the trash. At night, I read books from the library, novels, biographies, even gardening guides. I had forgotten what it felt like to learn for myself, not just work to survive. Each day, I felt myself growing stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I wasn't waiting for permission. My life was mine again, even if it was small, even if it was fragile, and I realized something simple but powerful. Dignity doesn't come from what you own. It comes from refusing to let anyone own you. The new number had been a wall of peace, a fortress around me. Only Mr. Garcia had it, and he used it once just to test the line, grumbling when it worked perfectly. For a week, silence reigned. Then, one evening, after I returned from the diner, the phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen showed an unfamiliar number, and for a moment I thought it was a wrong call. But something in my gut told me exactly who it was. I answered with a steady voice. "Hello?" A pause. Then Daniel's voice, cracked and uncertain. "Dad, it's me." The sound hit me like a hammer, but I stayed silent, waiting. He took a shaky breath. I found your new number. Don't hang up, please. I don't know who else to call." My hand tightened around the phone. I wanted to slam it shut, to protect the peace I had carved out. But there was fear in his voice, real fear, the kind a man can't fake. So I said, "I'm listening." His words tumbled out in a rush. "It's bad, Dad. Worse than you think. The loans, they're not just on paper. These guys, they don't care about signatures or rules. They want money, and they're saying if I don't pay soon, they'll come after everything. After you, after anyone close to me." His voice cracked then, raw with panic. I closed my eyes, breathing deep. The anger rose hot, but beneath it was something colder, sharper, clarity. "You signed my name, Daniel. You dragged me into this. That was your choice." "I know," he said quickly, desperation dripping from every syllable. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I didn't think it would get this bad. I thought I could handle it. Marissa kept telling me it was fine, that it was just temporary. Now she barely looks at me. She's packing her things, Dad. She's leaving." I leaned against the wall, staring at the small apartment I had fought to make mine. "Maybe that's the best thing that could happen," I said quietly. Silence stretched, broken only by his shallow breathing. Finally he whispered, "I don't want to lose you too." The words clawed at me. For years I had waited for him to say something like that, anything that sounded like the boy I had raised, but I couldn't let myself be pulled back into his chaos. I forced my voice steady. "I won't give you money, not $1. If you're calling for that, hang up now." "No," he said quickly. "I don't want your money. I need to know what to do. I don't know how to fix this." For a moment, my throat tightened. Advice was free. Love was free. But rescue, that was no longer mine to give. "You fix it by owning it, Daniel," I said. "You walk into the fire you built, and you don't drag me down with you." He didn't argue. He only whispered, "Okay," his voice breaking, before the line went dead. The call lingered in my mind for days, his voice cracking with fear, the boy inside him clawing through the man he had become. I wanted to believe he meant what he said, that he didn't want my money, that he truly wanted to change. But then I passed by the old house again one night, and what I saw told a different story. 2 sleek cars idled in the driveway, engines humming low, men leaning against the hoods with cigarettes glowing like embers in the dark. Their eyes tracked me as I drove past, sharp and unblinking. Inside, through the curtains, I caught a glimpse of Daniel pacing, his hands flailing as he argued. Marissa sat on the couch, calm and cold, her arms folded, her lips moving steadily as if every word were a command. He shook his head, gesturing wildly, but she only leaned back further, the queen on her throne. It struck me then. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't afraid. She was steering him deeper, her hand on the wheel of a sinking ship. Daniel was drowning, and she was pressing his head under with a smile. The next day, word filtered back through neighbors I still knew on that street. Packages delivered at odd hours, strange men visiting at night, shouting matches spilling out into the yard. Daniel's name carried through whispers at the diner, too. Customers mentioning debts, missed payments, a man trying to buy his way into status he couldn't afford. Every whisper was a knife, but I swallowed each one. At night, in my small apartment, I sat by the window and forced myself to breathe through the guilt. My hands itched to grab the phone, to call him, to storm that house and drag him out the way I once dragged him away from playground fights. But those days were gone. He wasn't a boy anymore. He had chosen this path. And if I rushed in now, if I threw him a rope, he would only use it to tie me back to his sinking ship. So I kept my distance. I worked my shifts. I watered the garden. I let the shoots rise higher, green vines stretching toward the sun. Life in the soil didn't beg for pity. It pushed forward because it had no choice. I had to be the same. Still, when I lay in bed at night, the silence pressed on me. I heard his voice from that call, soft and broken. "I don't want to lose you too." And I wondered if there was still a way to hold him without being dragged down, to love him without being consumed. But each time I asked myself, the answer came back the same. Not yet. He hadn't earned it. He hadn't chosen it. Until he did, I had to stay away, no matter how much it tore me apart. The garden was growing strong by then, the tomatoes already climbing, the beans curling up the stakes I had planted. Life followed order in the soil. Seed, sprout, stem, fruit. But in the world of men, order only came if you forced it. Daniel's chaos was a storm always circling, and I knew if I didn't build my walls high enough, it would sweep me away. So I started keeping everything. Every receipt from the diner, every stub from the warehouse, every payslip from the office job. I bought a small lockbox and filled it with records, neatly organized by date. I opened a binder and clipped in copies of the fraudulent loans, the ones bearing my name in crooked ink. Each page was proof, a shield I could raise if anyone came knocking. At the library, I asked the clerk about legal aid clinics. She gave me a flyer, her eyes soft with the kind of concern that asked no questions. I sat at my kitchen table that night and read it over under the dim lamp. Free consultations, help with fraud, help with identity theft. I traced my finger over the words and felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years: control. When the letter came from the bank demanding payment, I didn't crumble. I slid it into a folder, labeled it, and wrote the date in my notebook. Then I drafted my response. Short, factual, calm. I did not authorize this loan. Attached are copies of my identification. I am disputing this account. I made copies at the library, mailed them certified. Each step steadied me, like laying bricks in a wall I could stand behind. Mr. Garcia saw me one evening carrying the stack of papers up the stairs. "Looks serious," he said, his voice low. "It is," I admitted. He nodded once. "Don't let them push you around. Paper's powerful, but so's persistence. You show them you're not scared, they'll back down." His words stuck with me. Paper was powerful, and for once, I wasn't letting it be used against me. I was using it to fight back. Meanwhile, the calls from unknown numbers started again, but this time on the new phone. I never answered. I logged the dates and times in my notebook instead, a quiet ledger of harassment. If they thought they could wear me down, they didn't know me. I'd worked through pain worse than this. I'd carried grief heavier than their threats. One night, I sat at the table, the lockbox open, the binder spread out, my pen scratching steadily across the page. I realized then what I was doing. I wasn't just protecting myself, I was preparing for war, not with fists or shouting matches, but with proof, patience, and the stubbornness of a man who had finally learned to stop giving everything away. It was Evelyn who first mentioned him. We were out in the garden one evening, pulling weeds side by side, when she glanced toward the street. "You know that young guy who moved in across the way? He used to rent a place from your daughter-in-law's family. Didn't end well." The words caught me off guard. I wiped the sweat from my brow, turning to her. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, her hands still working the soil. "He's quiet about it, but I heard bits and pieces. Something about being bled dry, promises that turned into traps. Reminded me a little of what you've told me." The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I spotted the man, a wiry fellow in his 30s with tired eyes and a wary posture, smoking by the curb. I walked over slowly, hands in my pockets. "Afternoon," I said. He nodded without looking at me, the kind of nod men give when they don't want to talk. But when I mentioned Marissa's name, his eyes snapped, sped to mine. "You know her?" His voice was sharp, like a wound reopening. "She's my son's wife," I admitted. He spat onto the pavement. "Then you know what she is." I didn't answer, just waited. After a long pause, he sighed and rubbed his face. "I rented from her cousin a couple years back. Marissa handled all the paperwork. She acted sweet at first, always smiling, always saying she wanted to help. Then came the adjustments, extra fees, repairs that never got fixed, but somehow doubled the rent. By the time I realized what was happening, I was drowning. She had me signed to things I never even saw. She's good at it, making you feel like it's your fault, like you're the one failing." My chest tightened. His words were a mirror of my own life these past months. My own humiliation reflected back at me. "How did it end?" I asked quietly. He gave a humorless laugh. "I walked away with nothing. She threatened to sue, said she had paperwork that would ruin me. I didn't have the fight in me then, so I left. Lost everything." I stood there in silence, the weight of his story pressing into me. It wasn't just Daniel's weakness. It wasn't just my grief. Marissa had a pattern. She had sharpened cruelty into a weapon and wielded it with precision. My son wasn't her first victim. He might not even be her last. Before he went back inside, the man gave me one final look. "Be careful. She doesn't stop until you're empty." That night, I sat at my table, the lockbox open, the papers spread out, and I realized something cold and certain. This wasn't just about debts or betrayal anymore. It was about exposing her for what she was, not only to save myself, but maybe, just maybe, to save Daniel too. Once I knew the truth, I couldn't sit still. The man's words kept echoing in my head. "She doesn't stop until you're empty." I thought about the way Marissa's smile never reached her eyes, the way she spoke for Daniel as if his mouth belonged to her, the way paperwork kept appearing with my name forged neatly at the bottom. It was no accident. It was her craft. She was a sculptor, and ruin was her clay. So I began to collect more than just receipts and bank letters. I started listening. At the diner, I paid attention when customers whispered about landlords, when delivery drivers mentioned who ordered what and when. In the warehouse, I traded quiet nods with men who knew the smell of a scam a mile away. And in the evenings, I returned to the library, combing through public records with the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. It didn't take long. Marissa's name surfaced in lawsuits filed years ago, small claims at first, disputes over rent, unpaid damages, fees that ballooned out of nothing. Each case ended with her walking away richer and the other party poorer, too exhausted to fight. There were whispers online, too. Tenants who claimed they'd been tricked, employers who said she fabricated contracts. Different details, same pattern. I printed every scrap I found, tucking them into the binder alongside my own evidence. Page by page, the story was forming, not just of a greedy daughter-in-law, but of a predator hiding behind paperwork and charm. One evening, as I was leaving the library, Evelyn caught up with me. "You've been in there more than the students," she teased, but her eyes softened when she saw the weight of the binder in my arms. "You're building a case." "I'm building a truth," I said simply. She nodded. "Truth has a way of burning through lies, if you're patient enough." Back in my apartment, I spread the binder out on the table. Clara's quilt hung over the chair, her presence like a silent witness. I whispered to her the way I always did when the weight grew too heavy. "He's blind, Clara. He can't see what she is. But I will. I'll show him. I'll show everyone." The next Wednesday at the library, Daniel showed up again, this time with dark circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled. He looked like a man unraveling. He tried to speak, but I slid a folder across the table before he could. Inside were copies of those lawsuits, the names, the dates, the fees that grew like weeds. His face drained of color as he flipped through them. "This is who you've tied yourself to," I said, my voice steady. "She's been doing this long before you, and she'll do it long after, unless someone stops her, unless you stop her." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling over the pages. For the first time I saw it, not just fear, not just shame, but recognition, the first crack in her hold. Daniel didn't show up at my door after that meeting, but I knew the papers I handed him were burning a hole in his mind. The following days passed quietly for me. I worked, I watered the garden, I sipped my coffee in peace. But in that other house, the one that used to be mine, the storm was brewing. I could feel it. A week later, I got a call, not from Daniel, not from an unknown number, but from Evelyn. "Something's going on over there," she said in a hushed tone. "Voices, shouting, been carrying all down the street." That night, I drove past, slow enough to catch the sound before I even reached the driveway. Daniel's voice, raw and desperate, roared through the walls. "You lied to me, Marissa. You told me it was temporary, that it was just business, but you've been doing this for years." Marissa's reply cut sharp, her words laced with venom. "And what if I have? You think you're so much better? You signed the papers. You wanted the money, the cars, the dinners. Don't pretend you didn't know where it was coming from." Through the window, I saw him pacing, the binder of evidence spread across the table. His hands shook as he slammed a page down. "These aren't strangers, Marissa. These are scams. You've destroyed people's lives. My father's name is on half of this. You made me a part of it." She rose from her chair, her face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare put this on me. You were greedy enough to go along with it. You liked the taste of it until it turned bitter." She jabbed her finger at him, her voice climbing higher. "And your father? He's nothing but a bitter old man who wants to see us fail. He's feeding you lies, and you're too weak to see it." The sound of something breaking followed. A glass, hurled against the wall, shattering into shards. Daniel's voice cracked, almost pleading. No, I saw the court records. I saw the names. This isn't him making things up. This is real. You've been using me, Marissa, just like you've used everyone else." Her laughter chilled me even from outside. "Using you, Daniel? You wouldn't last a week without me. You can't even breathe unless I tell you how." Silence fell then, heavy and suffocating. I saw Daniel's shoulders slump, his hands covering his face. Marissa stood tall, unyielding, her silhouette framed by the light like a dark queen guarding her throne. I drove away before the shouting started again, but the image stayed with me. The son I had raised finally seeing the cage he was in, and the woman who had built it standing firm against his every attempt to break free. The war inside that house had begun, and for once, it wasn't mine to fight. It didn't take long for the counterattack to reach me. Predators don't sit quietly when their hold begins to crack. They lash out, clawing at anything that threatens the empire they've built. Marissa was no different. 2 mornings after the shouting match in their house, I found a letter slipped under my apartment door. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, precise, designed to look innocent. Inside was a typed statement, printed on clean paper. My eyes narrowed as I read. To whom it may concern, my father-in-law Richard has been harassing us, stalking our home, and attempting to extort money. He is mentally unstable and a danger to himself and others. My hands trembled as I turned the page. There were more lies, claims that I had threatened them, that I had tried to break into the house, that I had spread false rumors in the neighborhood. By the time I reached the bottom, my blood burned hotter than fire. At the bottom was her signature, neat as a dagger. Marissa Collins. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the words, rage pounding in my chest. She was trying to flip the story, to paint me as the villain, to strip me of the little dignity I had fought so hard to reclaim. For a moment I thought of crumpling the paper and throwing it away, but I didn't. Instead, I slid it into my binder, another piece of evidence, another shard of truth I would one day wield against her. That evening, Mr. Garcia knocked on my door. He held up a folded note. This was taped to the front of the building, he said grimly. I unfolded it and read the same accusations, this time written in bold, ugly letters. Beware of Richard, dangerous, a liar, a thief. My jaw clenched. She's trying to isolate me, I muttered. Mr. Garcia's eyes narrowed. You think I believe this trash? I've seen you. I know who you are. Don't let her shake you. His words steadied me more than I could say. The next Wednesday at the library, Daniel didn't come. Instead, Marissa walked in alone, her heels clicking on the tile like gunshots. She sat across from me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You're making a mistake, she said smoothly. Daniel may be weak, but I'm not. I'll ruin you before you ever ruin me. I leaned forward, my voice low, calm. You already ruined me once. Took my home, my money, my name. You think I'll let you do it again? I slid the letter across the table. Every word you write is another nail in your coffin. Keep them coming. Her smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. I gathered my binder and walked away, leaving her, sitting there, her mask slipping in the quiet of the library. For the first time, I knew she feared me, not because I was stronger, but because I had proof, and proof was something even she couldn't charm her way around forever. The lies could have crushed me once. A year ago, even a whisper of unstable or dangerous would have been enough to send me spiraling into silence, too beaten down to defend myself. But now I had my binder, I had my records, and I had something even stronger than paper. I had the fire of a man who had finally decided he deserved to fight for his own dignity. I went to the legal aid clinic on a gray Monday morning. The office was tucked inside a run-down building near the courthouse, its waiting room crowded with people who looked as tired and worn as I felt. A volunteer handed me a clipboard full of forms, and I sat at a plastic table, filling in line after line with slow, steady handwriting. Name, address, the debts I hadn't signed for, the letter accusing me of harassment, the false claims. Every box I checked was a reminder of how far they'd pushed me, and how far I had come to push back. When my name was called, I sat across from a young attorney who couldn't have been older than my son. Her suit was cheap, her hair tied back in a loose bun, but her eyes were sharp. Tell me everything, she said. I opened the binder. Page after page I laid it out. The fraudulent loans, the court records with Marissa's name, the letter accusing me of harassment, the note taped to the building. I showed her the timeline I had written in my notebook, each date, each call, each message logged in the black ink. She leaned back after an hour, her pen still in her hand. You've done more work than most people who walk in here, she said. This is good. This is very good. For the first time in months, I felt something like pride. She explained the next steps, filing formal disputes with the credit agencies, requesting investigations into the fraudulent loans, reporting Marissa's accusations as harassment. It won't be quick, she warned, but with this much documentation, you have a strong case, and once we put it on record, her ability to spin this against you shrinks fast. I nodded, my hand steady on the binder. That's all I want, to take my name back. She smiled faintly. And maybe more than that. If we can show a pattern of fraud, if we can prove she's been running scams, This doesn't just protect you. It could stop her from doing this to anyone else. The words lit something inside me. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about making sure no other father, no other man, found himself paying for dignity in his own home. When I left the clinic, the air felt different. The courthouse loomed across the street, and for the first time, I didn't look at it with fear. I looked at it with resolve. My fight was no longer just in shadows and whispers. My fight was about to be carved into record, where even Marissa's lies couldn't erase it. It was late, nearly midnight, when the knock came. Heavy, uneven, the kind of pounding that carried more desperation than strength. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to open the door. But then I heard his voice, raw, hoarse, yet almost childlike. "Dad, please, it's me." I unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. Daniel stood there, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He looked nothing like the polished man who once strutted through that big house with Marissa on his arm. He looked like a boy again, except this time the fear wasn't of thunderstorms or monsters under the bed. It was of the real monsters he had let into his life. "Please," he whispered again, his shoulders sagging. I didn't know where else to go. For a long moment I said nothing. I let him stand there in the dim hallway, shifting from foot to foot, his hands trembling. Finally, I stepped aside. "Come in." He sank into the old chair by the table, his head in his hands. "She's gone," he said finally. "Marissa. Packed her things and left this morning. Said I was worthless without her. Said I'd ruined everything." His voice cracked, and for a second I almost pitied him. But pity was dangerous. Pity was what had kept me chained for too long. "What about the loans?" I asked evenly. His shoulders tensed. He didn't look up. "They're calling every day. The men. They've been outside the house, following me. I don't sleep. I don't eat. I keep waiting for them to break the door down." I folded my hands on the table, my voice steady but sharp. "And what do you want from me, Daniel?" He finally looked at me, his eyes shining with tears. "Not money, I swear. I know you won't give me that. I don't know how to fix this. I thought I was smart enough, strong enough. But I'm not. I'm drowning, Dad." For a moment silence stretched between us. I saw the boy he had been, the man he had become, and the wreckage left behind. My heart ached, but my mind was clear. "You signed those papers. You shook those hands. You let her steer you into the fire. Now you have to walk through it yourself." He nodded slowly, his chin trembling. "I know. I didn't want to be alone tonight." I got up, poured him a glass of water, and set it in front of him. "You can sit here until morning, but understand this, Daniel. I won't be your shield. I won't pay your debts. What I will do is show you what standing on your own looks like. If you want a way out, you'll follow my lead, not hers." He gripped the glass with both hands, nodding, his tears dripping silently onto the table. And for the first time in years I felt like maybe, just maybe, my son was finally ready to listen. Daniel slept on the couch that night, restless and murmuring, like a man haunted by every shadow in his mind. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the streetlights fade into morning, listening to his uneven breathing. Part of me wanted to shake him awake, to demand answers, to ask how he could ever have let it come to this. But another part, the part that remembered him as a boy curled against my chest during thunderstorms, told me to wait. When the sun rose, I brewed coffee and set 2 mugs on the table. He stirred at the smell, his eyes heavy, his face pale. He sat down without a word, his hands shaking as he wrapped them around the warm cup. We sat in silence for a long while before I spoke. "You want to change? Then the first thing you have to do is face the truth. No more lies, no more hiding behind excuses. Tell me exactly how much you owe." His lips trembled. "I don't know," he whispered. I leaned forward, my voice hard. "Then find out, right now." I slid a pad of paper across the table and handed him a pen. He hesitated, then began writing down the names, the amounts, the interest he remembered. Each number seemed to drain the color from his face, but I made him keep going until the page was full. When he finally set the pen down, his hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the paper. 86,000, he said, his voice hollow. "That's just what I know about. There could be more." The number sat between us like a corpse. I stared at it, my jaw tight, my stomach churning. "And my name is tied to 50,000 of it," I said flatly. He nodded, shame pouring off him in waves. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know how to undo it. I tapped the page with my finger. This is how you start. You write it down, you face it, you stop pretending it's smaller than it is. That's the first rule of digging yourself out. You have to look at how deep the hole really is. Tears slid down his cheeks, but I didn't reach out to wipe them away. That was his weight to carry. What next? He asked hoarsely. You stop letting people like Marissa make your choices, I said. You cut ties with anyone who profits from your weakness. And then you start paying back what's yours, little by little. You work, you save, and you pay. It'll take years, maybe your whole life, but you'll know it's you digging yourself out, not someone else dragging you deeper. He nodded slowly, his hands clutching the paper as if it were a lifeline. For the first time in years, I saw not arrogance, not entitlement, but something close to humility in his eyes. And in that moment I realized this might be the only chance he had left to become the man I had once hoped he'd be. The next morning I told Daniel to come with me. He looked surprised, even hesitant, but I didn't give him room to argue. You say you want to change? Then you start where I started, on your feet, with your hands. We drove to the warehouse before dawn, the truck rattling as always, Daniel sitting stiff in the passenger seat. He kept glancing at me, as if waiting for me to soften, to give him an easier path, but there were no shortcuts left. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and metal, the clang of pallets and the steady groan of forklifts. I introduced him to the supervisor, a gruff man named Henry, who had known me for years. Henry raised an eyebrow at Daniel's pressed shirt and polished shoes. He won't last an hour, Henry muttered to me under his breath. Then he learns, I said simply. Daniel struggled from the start. The first crate he tried to lift nearly knocked him over. His hands blistered within an hour. His breath came ragged. His shirt stuck to him with sweat. He kept glancing at the clock, expecting time to move faster, but the minutes dragged like stones tied to his ankles. I didn't rescue him. When he dropped a box, I made him pick it up. When his knees buckled, I told him to straighten his back and try again. The other men smirked at first, whispering about the soft kid who thought he belonged here, but after a while, their smirks faded into nods, seeing that he didn't quit, even when his face went pale, even when his arms shook. By lunch, he slumped onto the bench beside me, his hands red and raw. He stared at the sandwich I handed him like it was the most precious thing in the world. How do you do this every day?" he panted. I looked at him steadily. "Because I had to. Because your mother depended on me. Because you depended on me. That's what work is, Daniel. It's not about wanting to. It's about having no choice but to keep going." His eyes dropped, shame clouding his face. "I thought I was better than this," he whispered. "You thought wrong," I said bluntly. "Work doesn't make you less. It makes you real. You've been living off illusions, money you didn't earn, power that wasn't yours. That's why you're drowning." He didn't argue. He only ate in silence, every bite slow, his eyes red but thoughtful. By the end of the shift, he could barely stand. His shoulders sagged, his arms limp, his pride shattered. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something new in him, a flicker of respect, not for me, but for the labor itself. For the first time, Daniel had tasted the cost of survival, and I could only hope it would be the first meal of many. I expected him to quit. Most men who tasted the warehouse once never wanted to taste it again. I figured he would sleep half the day, lick his wounds, and vanish back into whatever illusions he had left. But the next morning, just as I laced my boots in the quiet of my apartment, I heard movement behind me. Daniel emerged from the couch, his face pale, his body stiff, but his eyes holding something I hadn't seen in years. Resolve. "I'm coming," he said simply. I studied him, searching for the old arrogance, the excuses, the hollow confidence that had defined him for so long, but none of it was there, just pain and determination stitched over it. I nodded once. "Then wear different shoes," I told him. "Yours won't last another day." At the warehouse, the men laughed when they saw him again. "Didn't think the kid would crawl back," Henry muttered with a smirk. But Daniel ignored them this time. He bent to the work without complaint, his movements clumsy but steadier than the day before. He sweated through his shirt, blistered his hands raw, but he didn't stop. By midday, his breath came ragged, but he kept going. When one of the younger guys tried to slip him an easier task, Daniel shook his head. "If he can do it, so can I," he said, jerking his chin toward me. I caught the words, and something stirred in my chest, pride, though I fought to keep my face neutral. During lunch, he collapsed onto the bench beside me again, wincing as he stretched his arms. "I didn't think it would hurt this much," he admitted. It always hurts at first, I told him, handing him another sandwich. The question is whether you let the pain break you or shape you. He chewed slowly, staring at his blistered hands. I used to think money was just numbers, that as long as it came easy, it didn't matter where it came from. But this feels different. It feels real. I nodded. That's because it is. Every dollar you earn this way is a piece of your own skin. That's why it matters. That's why it has weight. By the end of the shift, he was staggering, but there was no shame in it. He had carried the weight, sweated through the hours, and finished what he started. Henry clapped him on the shoulder as he clocked out. Didn't think you'd last 2 days, kid. Maybe you've got more in you than I thought. Daniel managed a tired smile, and for once, it wasn't smug. It was humble, raw, real. When we climbed into the truck, he leaned his head back and whispered, I want to come back tomorrow. I didn't answer right away. I just drove, my eyes on the road, but inside me a small light flickered. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first step, and maybe the most important one. The third night, after another grueling shift, Daniel sat hunched at my table with his blistered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He hadn't said much on the drive home, just stared out the window like he was searching for a horizon he couldn't quite see. But now, in the quiet hum of my small apartment, the words began to spill out. I don't even know when it started, he said softly. Maybe the first time she told me we deserved more, that I deserved more. She said we were better than this neighborhood, better than ordinary lives. She made me believe it, Dad. Every dinner out, every trip we couldn't afford, she called it an investment in who we were supposed to be. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. He rubbed his temples, his voice breaking. At first it was small things. A little loan here, a little signature there. She said no one would ever notice, that it wasn't really stealing, just bending the rules. But it grew, every month, bigger and bigger. And I let her steer me, because it felt good not to be the scared kid anymore. I thought she was making me strong, but all she did was make me weak. His eyes glistened, shame flooding his face. When she told me to charge you rent, I argued. I swear I did. But she said you were old, that you'd already lived your life, that it was time you contributed to ours. She said if you loved me, you'd do it without complaint. And I let her words poison me. I told myself it was fair, that I deserved it after everything you gave me growing up. But now, sitting here, I can't believe I ever thought that way. My chest tightened. For months, I had imagined these words, begged silently for them, but hearing them now didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning the son I'd lost to her voice long before I even realized he was gone. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. I ruined you, Dad. I ruined us. And she just walked away without a second glance. I leaned forward, my voice steady but hard. No, Daniel. She didn't ruin me. I let myself be broken because I couldn't let go of the idea that love meant sacrifice without end. That was my mistake. But you let her take your backbone and replace it with greed. And now you're paying the price. His shoulders slumped, but he nodded, tears streaking his face. I want to be better, he whispered. I don't know how yet, but I want to. For the first time in years, I believed him, not because of his words, but because of the rawness in his eyes, the boy I once knew flickering there again. And though forgiveness wasn't ready to bloom, I felt the soil shifting inside me, readying for something new. 2 days later, I told Daniel he needed to come with me to the legal aid clinic. He looked startled, almost like a boy summoned to the principal's office. I thought you were handling that part, he said weakly. I shook my head. No, this isn't my fight to finish for you. If you're serious about changing, you have to stand in front of someone official and own what you've done. You can't hide behind me anymore. He hesitated, but something in my tone must have reached him. When we walked into the small office, his shoulders were tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes darting around like he wanted to bolt. I remembered feeling the same way the first time I came here, like every mistake I'd ever made was written on my forehead. The young attorney greeted us with the same sharp-eyed kindness she'd shown me. I stepped back, letting Daniel sit across from her alone. She glanced at me, but I shook my head. He needs to tell you himself, I said quietly. For a long moment, Daniel sat frozen. Then slowly the words began to come. My name is Daniel Collins, he said, his voice cracking. I signed loans I couldn't pay back. Some in my name, some in my father's. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. And now the men who gave them to me, they're threatening us. He broke off, his face red with shame. The lawyer leaned forward, her tone calm but firm. "Thank you for being honest. That's the first step. But I need details, dates, amounts, names." His hands trembled as he pulled out the crumpled sheet of paper he had written on at my kitchen table. He slid it across to her. She studied it, her brow furrowing deeper with each line. Finally, she looked at him again. "This is serious, but it's not hopeless. Fraud, predatory lending, harassment, we've seen all of it. If you're willing to cooperate fully, we can start building a case that protects both you and your father." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." I watched him then, the weight of his choices pressing down, but not crushing him. He wasn't looking to me to answer for him anymore. He was facing her directly, answering her questions with trembling honesty. For the first time, I saw him beginning to carry his own burden. When the meeting ended, the lawyer handed him a packet of forms. "Fill these out. It won't be easy, but if you stick with it, we can fight this." Outside, Daniel sat on the curb, staring at the papers in his hands. His eyes glistened, but there was a steadiness in them too. "I thought walking in there would kill me," he admitted. "But it didn't. It feels like the first step." I sat beside him, the morning sun warming our backs. "That's exactly what it is," I said, "and the steps don't stop here." The first time I saw him leave without me, I thought maybe I was dreaming. I'd just come home from the night shift at the diner, my bones heavy with fatigue, when I spotted Daniel lacing up a pair of scuffed work boots by the door. He glanced at me, nervous, like a child caught sneaking out, but his voice was steady. I picked up a shift. "Warehouse needs extra hands." I stared at him for a long moment. No arrogance, no excuses, just a man, quietly choosing to work. "You don't need me to walk you in?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not this time." I watched him go, the door clicking shut behind him, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope that wasn't laced with doubt. He wasn't doing it because I dragged him. He wasn't doing it to impress me. He was doing it because he finally understood the price of his mistakes and the value of earning something with his own hands. That night, when I clocked in at the diner, one of the cooks nudged me. "Saw your boy at the warehouse this morning. Didn't think he had it in him. But he worked, I'll give him that." The words settled in me like a small flame against the cold. Not pride yet, not fully, but something close. When Daniel came back that evening, his shirt drenched in sweat, his arms trembling, I expected him to collapse on the couch. Instead, he dropped a folded slip of paper onto the table. "My first paycheck," he said simply. His voice carried no boast, no demand for approval. He didn't even open the envelope. He just left it there, a quiet offering, as though the paper itself was proof enough. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't much, barely a dent in the mountain of debt he had piled up. But it was real, honest, his own. And that made it worth more than the thousands he had stolen in my name. Later that night, I found him in the small garden with Evelyn, crouched beside the tomato plants. His hands were still red and raw, but he touched the soil gently, listening as she showed him how to tie the vines to the stakes. He looked younger there, almost like the boy who once dug with Clara in the backyard. I stood in the doorway, unseen, and let the sight sink deep into me. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still learn. Maybe he could still grow. When he came inside, his voice was quiet, tired but sure. "I'm going back tomorrow. I need the hours." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Then go back," I said, "every day you can, because the only way out of the hole you dug is with your own hands." And for once, he didn't flinch at my words. He just nodded, as if he finally understood. It was only a matter of time before she reappeared. Women like Marissa didn't vanish. They circled, waiting for the moment when weakness cracked through. And though Daniel was working, sweating, and finally beginning to stand on his own, I knew he was still fragile. One look from her could send him tumbling if he wasn't careful. She showed up at the warehouse one evening, just as the men were clocking out. Evelyn's nephew worked there too, and word reached me before Daniel even walked through my door. "Some fancy woman in heels yelling in the parking lot," the boy said. "Your son looked like he wanted to sink into the ground." When Daniel finally came home, his face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. He dropped his boots by the door and sat heavily at the table. "She found me," he muttered, "waited by the cars, said she wanted to talk." I didn't interrupt. I let him tell it. His voice was low, trembling with the echo of her words. "She said I'm pathetic, that I threw everything away for this." He gestured around my small apartment. "She said I'll never be anything with child. Without her, that I'm just a scared boy pretending to be a man. The old Daniel would have defended her, excused her, twisted her venom into something resembling truth. But this time he shook his head, his eyes blazing with something new. I told her she was wrong. I told her I don't need her anymore. And she laughed, Dad. She laughed in my face, said she'll see me crawling back in a month. He looked at me then, searching my face, like a child waiting to know if he'd done the right thing. My chest ached, but I kept my voice steady. And what do you believe? He swallowed hard. I don't know. Part of me still hears her voice, still thinks maybe she's right. But when I was lifting crates today, when the sweat was dripping into my eyes and my hands burned, I felt something real, something that was mine, and I don't want to lose that. I reached across the table, my hand steady on his shoulder. Then hold on to it, because she'll try again. She'll show up when you're tired, when you're broke, when you're desperate. That's when she's strongest. But if you stand your ground, if you keep working, she'll have nothing left to take. For a long time he sat there in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. Finally he nodded. I don't ever want to go back. I believed him, not because of his words, but because of the way his hands still bore the fresh calluses of honest work. Those marks were his armor now, and maybe, just maybe, they'd be enough to keep him from falling into her trap again. I should have known Marissa wouldn't retreat quietly. A woman like her never accepts losing control. She twists the board until she feels like the queen again. The first sign came in the form of an envelope slipped under my door, the kind that made my stomach tighten before I even picked it up. Inside was a notice, formal, stamped, with my name bold across the top. It claimed I had defaulted on a personal loan of $15,000. The signature at the bottom looked eerily like mine, too much like mine. My hand shook, but I forced myself to study it. This wasn't sloppily done like Daniel's forgeries. This was careful, professional, the kind of fraud perfected by someone who had been practicing for years. I didn't need to guess who had arranged it. At the legal aid clinic the next morning, I laid the paper in front of the young attorney. Her eyes narrowed as she examined it. She's escalating, she said grimly. She's trying to bury you under false claims so you look guilty when you fight the real ones. I clenched my fists. Can she get away with this? The lawyer shook her head. Not if we document everything. Bring me every scrap of mail, every letter, every notice. We'll file a fraud report, but you need to be prepared. This could get ugly before it gets better. She's not just fighting for money. She's fighting to destroy your credibility. That night, as I sat at the table with my binder open, Daniel walked in, his shirt damp with sweat from another shift. He froze when he saw the new papers. What's that? Another loan, I said flatly. In my name. His face drained of color. Dad, I swear I didn't. I know, I cut him off. This wasn't you. This has her fingerprints all over it. He sank into the chair across from me, his hands buried in his hair. She told me once. She said she could make anyone disappear on paper. That once she was finished, even their own family wouldn't believe them. The rage that rose in me was colder than fire. She underestimates me, I said. She thinks I'll fold under her lies. But I've been working my whole life, Daniel. I know how to carry weight. And I'll carry this fight until she can't hurt either of us again. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide with something I hadn't seen in him for years. Respect. What do we do? He asked quietly. I slid the fraudulent loan notice into the binder, the pages thick now with every crime she'd tried to bury me under. We do the only thing that works with people like her. We outlast her. We make the truth louder than her lies. And when the time comes, we bring it all into the light. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing to expose her. It was a Friday evening when Daniel came home later than usual, his face pale, his jaw tight. He didn't speak at first, just sat at the table, staring at his hands as if the words were carved into his skin. Finally, he said, "She found me again." My chest tightened. What did she want this time? He swallowed hard. She said you're using me, that you're the one pulling the strings now. She told me you're making me work these shifts just to punish me. She said you've been collecting evidence, not to protect me, but to destroy me along with her. His voice cracked, and I saw the war in his eyes, the poison of her words battling against the truth he'd been learning here. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. And what do you believe, Daniel? For a long moment, he didn't answer. He looked like a boy again, torn between two parents, one offering comfort laced with poison, the other offering discipline laced with love. Finally, his hands curled into fists. I believe her voice is still in my head, but I don't believe her anymore. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. He went on, his voice trembling but steady. She begged me to come back. Said she'd fix everything if I just trusted her one more time. But Dad, I told her no. I told her I'm done being her puppet. And when she screamed at me, when she said I'd regret it for the rest of my life, I walked away. My chest ached with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. That took strength, I said quietly. He shook his head, tears burning his eyes. It didn't feel like strength. It felt like cutting off my own arm, but I knew if I stayed, she'd kill whatever was left of me. I couldn't let her do that anymore. For a long while, we sat in silence, the weight of his confession heavy but cleansing. Then I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. She's losing her grip because you're finally standing up. That's what scares her. And she should be scared, because the man you're becoming isn't hers to control. He's his own. Daniel's shoulders shook, and for a moment he let the tears fall freely. Not the tears of a spoiled man who had lost his comforts, but the tears of a son who had finally broken free of his captor. When he looked up at me again, his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. "I want to make it right, Dad," he whispered. "Not just for me, for you, for Mom, for everything I destroyed." I squeezed his hand once, firm and steady. "Then we'll do it, together. But this time, on truth, not lies." For the first time in a long time, I believed him, not because he said it, but because Marissa's poison had finally lost its hold. The courthouse smelled of paper and polish, the kind of place where lives are either crushed under the weight of lies or resurrected by the power of truth. Daniel walked beside me, his shoulders stiff, his suit borrowed from a thrift shop. He looked older somehow, not because of the wrinkles of age, but because of the weight of responsibility he was finally carrying. We sat before the judge with our binders stacked thick on the table, page after page of records, letters, false signatures, and testimonies. Marissa entered the room like she always had, heels clicking, head held high, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. She wore power like a gown, certain that charm and venom would save her one last time. But this time, she wasn't in control. The attorney laid out the case piece by piece, each document a brick in the wall I had built to defend myself. The forged loans, the harassment letters, the old lawsuits that revealed her pattern, and finally, Daniel's own testimony. He spoke with a trembling voice, but did not waver, admitting his role, confessing the shame, pointing to Marissa as the architect behind it all. For the first time, I saw her mask falter. Her smile tightened, her eyes darted, her hands clutched at the edge of the table. She tried to interrupt, tried to turn the blame back on me, but the judge silenced her, and when the verdict came, it was clear. The debts in my name were fraudulent, struck from the record. Marissa was ordered under investigation for fraud and harassment. Daniel and I walked out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. For a long time we didn't speak. He stood there, his shoulders trembling, his eyes red but clear. Finally he turned to me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." I looked at him, the boy I had raised, the man he was finally becoming, and I shook my head. "No, Daniel, you saved yourself. I just held the light so you could see the path." We drove back to Maple Street, where the garden waited, the tomatoes ripening, the sunflowers tall and strong. We sat side by side on the stoop, watching the world move around us. For once, silence wasn't heavy, it was peace. As I sit here now, telling you this story, I want you to remember something. Love without boundaries becomes chains, but love with truth can break them. I gave everything I had and was left with nothing. But I learned that even at my lowest, I could rebuild, not just a life, but myself. And in doing so, I helped my son find his way back too. If my story has reached you, if you felt even a piece of my journey in your own heart, then let this be your Remai. Dare. It's never too late to take back your dignity, never too late to rise from the ashes of betrayal. And before you go, I ask only this. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments what you would fight for if everything was stripped away. Because sometimes the fight itself is what makes us whole again.